want a job. My mom is dying.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Let's see what we can do to help.
Please, sir, you have to help us.
I understand and I want to help. Let me see what I can do.
She wasn't there because she dreamed of working in a big office. She was there because she understood something no child should have to learn so early. She knew the world wasn't fair. She had learned that young. She walked in carrying a truth she learned too early. In her world, help was hard to find, and for someone like her, it rarely came freely. Her mother was dying, and time was running out. She didn't come looking for pity. She came looking for a job. Even if it meant scrubbing floors or cleaning offices, she believed working was her only chance. Because in her mind, earning money was the last hope she had to keep her mother alive. But in the marble lobby of Walker Enterprises, the city's most prestigious investment firm, stood a figure that didn't belong. She was small, no more than 6 years old, with deep brown skin and dark eyes that held far too much weight for someone so young. Her feet were bare, dusty from the long walk through the city streets, and her knees were smudged with dirt where she had likely stumbled and caught herself. The dress she wore hung loosely on her thin frame, a faded floral pattern that had clearly been someone else's hand-me-down, torn at the hem and stained along the collar. She stood perfectly still in the center of that gleaming lobby, surrounded by polished granite and brass fixtures, looking impossibly fragile against the cold grandeur of her surroundings. Around her, professionals in expensive shoes clicked past without a second glance, their eyes fixed on their phones or locked straight ahead, their minds already running through morning meetings and quarterly projections. To them, she was invisible, a disruption in the carefully ordered world they had built for themselves. But then she spoke. Her voice was small and trembling, yet it carried across that vast space with startling clarity. "Please, sir," she said, looking up at a man in a charcoal suit who had paused near the elevators. "I don't want money. I just need a job so my mummy won't die." The man's face flickered with something between confusion and discomfort before he hurried into the elevator without a word. The girl remained where she was, her small hands clasped together in front of her chest, waiting for someone, anyone, to stop. Manhattan had no time for the poor. The city moved with a rhythm that rewarded speed and punished hesitation, and if you couldn't keep pace, you were left behind without ceremony or apology. The streets were loud with honking taxis and the screech of subway brakes below the pavement. The sidewalks were packed with people who walked as if the ground might give way beneath them if they slowed for even a moment. It was a city of ambition and accomplishment, a city that built towers to scrape the sky and fortunes that spanned generations. But it was also a city that had learned not to see the ones who fell through the cracks. The little girl's name was Rachel. She had walked 7 blocks that morning, clutching a crumpled plastic grocery bag that held the only thing she had left to hold on to. Hospital discharge papers stamped in red ink with the words, "Payment required," a photocopy of her mother's ID, and a handwritten note from a neighbor who had helped her find the address of this building. She had no shoes because the only pair she owned had split apart 2 weeks ago, and her mother couldn't afford to replace them. The dress she wore had come from a church donation bin, still carrying the faint scent of someone else's perfume. That morning, before the sun had risen, Rachel's mother had collapsed again. It was the 3rd time in as many weeks, her body finally giving out under the weight of an illness that had been growing quietly inside her for months. Rachel had learned to call 911 by herself now, had learned to unlock the apartment door when the paramedics arrived, had learned to answer their questions with a calm that no child should possess. But when they arrived at the hospital this time, the nurse at the front desk had barely looked up from her computer screen. "No payment, no treatment," she said flatly, sliding a clipboard across the counter. Rachel's mother had tried to explain, had tried to beg, but the nurse simply pointed toward the exit and called for the next patient. So Rachel had made a decision. She had taken the papers, kissed her mother's fevered forehead, and walked out of that hospital with a plan forming in her young mind. She had heard people talk about jobs, about working, about earning money to pay for things. She didn't fully understand how it worked, but she understood that rich people had jobs and poor people needed them. And the richest person she had ever heard of worked in the tall glass building she had seen from the bus window during their rare trips across town. The poor are ignored by the rich, but Rachel believed that if she could just make someone listen, If she could just make them understand, then maybe, just maybe, she could save her mother's life. The security guard spotted her first. He was a broad-shouldered man with graying temples and a name tag that read Marcus, and his face twisted into something between concern and annoyance as he approached the small girl standing in the middle of his pristine lobby. "Hey," he called out, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "this isn't a place for kids. Where are your parents?" Rachel looked up at him with those wide, tired eyes, but didn't move. She simply stood there, clutching her plastic bag, her bare feet planted on the cold floor. Other people had begun to notice now. A woman in a cream-colored blazer whispered something to her colleague, and they both glanced over with poorly concealed judgment. Two young men in matching navy suits paused by the coffee station, one of them snickering behind his hand. "Probably looking for a handout," someone muttered loud enough for Rachel to hear. The guard moved closer, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but not quite touching, as if he wasn't sure whether to guide her out gently or call for backup. "Sweetheart, you can't be here. You need to leave." But Rachel didn't leave. Instead, with a quiet defiance that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient within her, she walked over to the side of the lobby and sat down on the marble floor. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her thin arms around them and rested her chin on top, making herself as small as possible. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't crying or shouting. She was simply refusing to disappear. The guard looked helplessly toward the reception desk, where the woman stationed there was already reaching for the phone to call upper management. The whispers around the lobby grew louder, more uncomfortable. This was a place where problems were supposed to be solved with efficiency and discretion, but no one seemed to know quite what to do with a 6-year-old girl who wouldn't leave. That's when Liz appeared. She was an executive assistant on the 15th floor, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and silver streaks running through her dark hair. She had been on her way to drop off documents when she noticed the small crowd forming near the entrance. Something about the scene made her pause, made her set down her leather portfolio and move closer. When she saw Rachel sitting there on the floor, so small and still and utterly alone, something in Liz's chest tightened. She walked past the security guard without a word, knelt down on the hard marble floor until she was at eye level with the little girl, and spoke in a voice that was gentle, but not patronizing. "Hi there," Liz said softly. "My name is Liz. What's yours?" Rachel lifted her head slowly, studying the woman's face for any sign of cruelty or dismissal. When she saw only genuine concern, something in her seemed to crack just slightly. "Rachel," she whispered. "Rachel," Liz repeated, letting the name settle between them. "That's a beautiful name. Can you tell me why you're here, sweetheart? Are you lost?" Rachel shook her head, her small fingers tightening around the plastic bag. "I'm not lost," she said quietly. "I came here to ask for a job. My mommy is very sick and the hospital won't help her unless we pay. I thought maybe if I could work, I could earn the money to save her." The words hung in the air like a prayer, simple and desperate and impossible to ignore. Liz felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she reached out slowly, carefully, to place a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice breaking just slightly. "You are so brave. Will you let me help you?" Rachel nodded, and for the first time that morning, something like hope flickered across her young face. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Liz didn't know why that verse came to her mind in that moment, but it settled over her like a charge, like a calling she couldn't ignore. She stood up, still holding Rachel's hand, and looked directly at the security guard with an authority she rarely used. "She's coming with me," Liz said firmly. "I'm taking her upstairs." The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, except for the soft hum of machinery and the occasional ding as they passed each level. Rachel stood beside Liz, still clutching her plastic bag, watching the numbers climb higher and higher on the digital display. 32, 33, 34. She had never been this high up in a building before, and despite everything weighing on her small shoulders, she felt a flutter of wonder in her chest. When the doors finally opened on the 45th floor, Rachel stepped out into a world that seemed to exist in a different dimension entirely from the one she knew. The executive suite was all floor-to-ceiling windows and polished hardwood, with modern art, hanging on cream-colored walls and furniture that looked like it had been designed by people who had never worried about comfort because they'd never had to worry about anything at all. The air itself felt different up here, cleaner somehow, filtered and climate-controlled to perfection. Liz led Rachel past a series of glass-walled offices where men and women in expensive suits sat hunched over computers or spoke in low voices into phone headsets, none of them looking up as the strange pair walked by. At the far end of the hall was a set of double doors made of dark mahogany, and beyond them was the office of James Walker himself. Liz knocked twice, waited for the curt, "Come in" from inside, and then gently guided Rachel through the doorway into the presence of one of the most powerful men in the city. James Walker sat behind a desk that was larger than Rachel's entire bedroom, his back to them, as he stared out at the Manhattan skyline spread before him like a kingdom he'd conquered. He was a tall man, lean and sharp-featured, with silver threading through his dark hair, and the kind of posture that suggested he'd never slumped in his life. His suit was charcoal grey and perfectly tailored, his tie a deep burgundy that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He didn't turn around when they entered, didn't acknowledge them at all for a long moment, as if waiting to see whether they'd dare interrupt his thoughts. "Mr. Walker?" Liz said carefully, her voice professional but firm. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's someone here who needs to speak with you. It's important." James finally turned, his expression already forming into the cool dismissal he'd perfected over decades of turning away people who wanted something from him. But when his eyes landed on Rachel, something flickered across his face, too quick to name. Confusion, perhaps, or irritation at the absurdity of a child standing in his office. "Liz," he said slowly, his voice deep and controlled. "What is this?" There was no warmth in the question, no curiosity, only the flat tone of a man who had learned long ago not to let emotion color his words. Liz stepped forward, her hand still resting protectively on Rachel's shoulder. "This is Rachel. She came to the building this morning asking for help. Her mother is sick and she needs—" But James cut her off with a raised hand. "I don't do charity cases, Liz. You know that. Take her to HR. They can direct her to the appropriate social services." He had already started to turn back to his window, already dismissing them from his mind, when Rachel did something that changed everything. She stepped forward, pulling away from Liz's gentle grip, and walked right up to that massive desk with a courage that seemed to come from some deep well she didn't know she possessed. From her plastic bag, she pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times it was soft as cloth. It was a drawing, done in crayons that were worn down to nubs, showing a small girl with dark skin holding a yellow flower and standing beside a tall figure in a suit. Above them was a sky made of blue scribbles and a sun that was really just an orange circle with lines radiating outward. Rachel placed the drawing on James's desk with both hands, smoothing it out carefully, and then looked up at him with those impossibly old eyes. In the corner of the page, written in the uneven handwriting of someone just learning to form letters, were the words, "Please let me work, my mummy is very sick." The crayon marks were smudged in places, as if small fingers had rubbed across them while the wax was still fresh. James stared down at the drawing, his expression unreadable, his jaw working as if he was trying to find words and couldn't quite locate them. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. For a long moment no one moved. The city stretched out behind James, indifferent and eternal, while inside that office something was breaking open that had been sealed shut for years. James's hand reached out slowly, his fingers hovering over the drawing as if it might burn him if he touched it. Then his whole body went rigid, his face draining of color, and Liz saw something she had never seen in all her years working for this man. Tears forming in the corners of James Walker's eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow, sudden and merciless and impossible to push away. Another little girl, another crayon drawing, another time when his heart had still been capable of breaking. Her name had been Emma, and she had been 6 years old, the same age as the child standing before him now. She had died 7 years ago, a sudden illness that came on too fast for even the best doctors and the most expensive treatments to stop. He remembered her laughter, high and bright, the way she used to climb into his lap while he worked and demand that he pay attention to her instead of his computer. He remembered the drawings she used to make, always showing the two of them together, always with that same yellow sun in the corner. After Emma died, James had sealed off that part of himself, had built walls so high and so thick that nothing could penetrate them. He threw himself into his work with a ferocity that terrified his competitors and exhausted his staff. He stopped going home to the empty house in Connecticut, where her room still sat untouched. He stopped attending charity galas and social functions where people offered their sympathies with pitying looks. He became exactly what the business world wanted him to be: ruthless, efficient, emotionally untouchable, a machine that made money and wielded power without the messy complications of caring about anything or anyone. But now, looking down at Rachel's drawing, at the careful way she had drawn that small girl holding a flower, something in him cracked. He saw Emma in her, saw the same desperate hope, the same innocent belief that adults could fix anything if they just tried hard enough. His breath caught in his throat, and before he fully realized what he was doing, James Walker lowered himself to his knees so that he was at eye level with this child who had somehow found her way into his fortress. "What's your name?" he asked, and his voice was different now, softer, almost gentle. "Rachel," she whispered, her eyes wide. He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "Rachel, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not going to give you money. Do you understand?" Rachel's face fell slightly, but she nodded. James reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the desk. "I'm not going to give you money, because money isn't what you need right now. What you need is action. What you need is for someone to actually do something. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to help your mother. Right now. Today." The little girl's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded again, this time more vigorously. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, sir." James stood up, his decision made, his usual cool composure returning, but now tempered with something new, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. He looked at Liz, who was watching him with barely concealed shock. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the day," he said. "All of them. Tell Marcus to bring the car around. We're going to the hospital. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." The ride to the hospital took 20 minutes through midday traffic, and James sat in the back of his black town car, with Rachel beside him, asking her quiet questions about her mother, about where they lived, about how long she'd been sick. Rachel answered in her small voice, her hands folded in her lap, still hardly believing that this was really happening. When they pulled up in front of Metropolitan Public Hospital, a crumbling building in a part of the city where luxury cars rarely ventured, James didn't hesitate. He stepped out, helped Rachel down, and walked through the automatic doors with the kind of confidence that suggested he owned the place. The emergency waiting room was packed with people sitting in plastic chairs, some holding crying babies, others pressing blood-soaked towels to wounds, all of them wearing the exhausted expression of those who had learned to wait and wait and wait. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over everything, and the smell of disinfectant, mixed with something less pleasant, hung heavy in the stale air. Rachel led James to the front desk, where a tired-looking nurse with dark circles under her eyes was typing something into an ancient computer. "Excuse me," Rachel said quietly. "My mommy is here. She needs help." The nurse didn't look up, just held up one finger in a universal gesture for "wait a moment," while she continued typing. James stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the space, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that made people snap to attention. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge. Now." The nurse finally looked up, her expression cycling quickly from irritation to confusion to recognition. She knew who James Walker was. Everyone in this city knew who James Walker was, and her entire demeanor shifted. "Mr. Walker," she stammered, sitting up straighter. "I didn't realize. What can we do for you?" James placed both hands on the counter and leaned forward slightly. This child's mother was brought here this morning and was turned away because she couldn't pay. "I want to know where she is. I want to know what her condition is, and I want to know what it's going to cost to get her the treatment she needs, and I want to know all of this in the next 60 seconds. The nurse's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up records, her previous exhaustion replaced by something close to panic. Her name is Diana Marshall. She's in the waiting area. We told her we couldn't admit her without payment up front, but she refused to leave. She's been sitting over there for the past 3 hours. The nurse pointed to a corner of the waiting room where a woman sat slumped in a chair, her head resting against the wall, her face pale and drawn. Rachel broke away from James and ran to her, wrapping her small arms around her mother's neck. "Mommy," she cried. "Mommy, I got help. I got help." Diana's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy with fever, and when she saw her daughter, she tried to smile. "Baby," she whispered, "you shouldn't be here. You should be at school." But then her gaze shifted past Rachel to the man in the expensive suit who was now speaking in low, firm tones to the hospital administrator, who had materialized from somewhere in the back offices. James was pulling out his phone, making calls, his voice cutting through the chaos of the waiting room with crystal clarity. Within minutes, orderlies appeared with a wheelchair. Within 10 minutes, Diana was being moved to a private room. Within 15, a team of doctors was examining her, running tests, starting treatments that had been deemed too expensive just hours before. James stood in the hallway outside Diana's room, his arms crossed, watching through the window as they worked. Rachel stood beside him, her small hand finding his, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so young. "Thank you," she said again, and this time her voice wasn't a whisper but something fuller, something that carried weight. James looked down at her, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt something other than the hollow ache that had become his constant companion. He felt useful, he felt necessary, he felt almost human again. "Faith without works is dead." The words echoed in his mind, though he couldn't remember where he'd heard them. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had acted, that he had used his power for something other than accumulating more power, and that somehow in the process he had found a reason to care again. He squeezed Rachel's hand gently and made a silent promise to himself that he would see this through, that he wouldn't abandon this child or her mother the way he'd let himself abandon everything else that mattered after Emma died. By the time the doctors assured James that Diana's condition had stabilized and that she would recover with proper treatment and rest, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. Rachel had refused to leave her mother's side for hours, sitting in a chair that was far too large for her, watching every monitor, every IV drip, every movement the nurses made, as if she could will her mother back to health through sheer attention. But when Diana finally fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, her breathing steady and her color returning, James gently placed his hand on Rachel's shoulder and suggested they let her rest. Rachel looked up at him with exhausted gratitude, and it was only then that James truly saw the state she was in. The dust on her knees had turned to grime, her bare feet were scraped and dirty from her journey across the city, and her torn dress hung on her like a flag of surrender to circumstances beyond her control. Without a word, James made another series of phone calls, his voice quiet but insistent, and within the hour, a woman arrived carrying shopping bags from stores that most people only window shopped at, while dreaming of different lives. James had one of the hospital social workers take Rachel to a private bathroom where she could shower, and when she emerged 20 minutes later, her skin scrubbed clean and her hair washed and carefully braided by the kind social worker, she looked like a different child entirely. The woman helped her into new clothes, a simple but well-made navy blue dress with white trim, clean white socks, and a pair of sturdy shoes that actually fit. There was also a warm jacket, soft and lined with fleece, because James had noticed how she'd shivered in the air-conditioned hospital corridors. When Rachel walked back into the waiting area where James stood checking his phone, she moved with a tentative grace, as if she wasn't quite sure she deserved these new things, as if at any moment someone might realize a mistake had been made and take them all back. James looked up from his phone and something in his expression softened, though he tried to maintain his composure. "Better?" he asked simply. Rachel nodded, then looked down at her new shoes, flexing her toes inside them experimentally. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. But then she looked back up at him, and there was something in her eyes that James hadn't expected to see. Determination mixed with worry. She took a small breath, gathering her courage, and asked the question that had been weighing on her since the moment he'd promised to help. "Sir," she began, her voice small but steady, "can I still work?" James blinked, momentarily confused. "Work," he repeated. Rachel nodded earnestly, her small hands clasping together in front of her. "You helped my mommy, and I'm so grateful, I really am, but I still want to work. I don't want to just take things. I want to earn them. Can I still have a job?" The question hung in the air between them, and James found himself at a complete loss for words. In his world, in the world of mergers and acquisitions and billion-dollar deals, no one had ever asked him for the dignity of earning rather than receiving. People wanted his money, his influence, his name attached to their causes, but never had anyone, especially not a 6-year-old child, asked for the right to contribute rather than simply consume his charity. He looked at Rachel, really looked at her, and saw something that humbled him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Integrity that had nothing to do with wealth or status or power, but everything to do with character. "Better is the poor who walks in integrity." The phrase drifted through his mind like a whisper from somewhere beyond himself, and he knew in that moment that he was standing in the presence of someone far stronger than he had ever been. "Yes," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Yes, Rachel. You can still work. In fact, I have the perfect job for you." Rachel's face lit up with a smile so pure and genuine that James had to look away for a moment, afraid of what he might feel if he stared at that joy too long. The next morning, when James Walker arrived at his office building with Rachel beside him, the entire lobby seemed to freeze in collective shock. Gone was the barefoot, dusty child who had sat on the marble floor the previous day. In her place walked a little girl in a clean navy dress, her hair neatly braided, holding James Walker's hand with the unself-conscious trust of someone who had never learned to question miracles when they appeared. The security guard, Marcus, stared openly as they passed, his mouth slightly agape. The receptionist fumbled with her coffee cup, nearly spilling it across her desk. Every professional in that lobby turned to watch as the most powerful man in the building walked hand in hand with a child toward the executive elevators. The whispers started before the elevator doors even closed. James could feel them rippling through the lobby, like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in concentric circles of shock and speculation and judgment. He'd expected this, of course. He'd built his reputation on being ruthlessly professional, on maintaining clear boundaries between business and sentiment, on never allowing personal feelings to interfere with the pursuit of profit. And now, here he was, arriving at work with a 6-year-old child in tow, looking for all the world like he'd lost his mind overnight. When they reached the 45th floor, the reaction was even more pronounced. Liz was waiting by the elevator, having been briefed by James early that morning about his plans, and she smiled warmly at Rachel as they stepped out. But behind her, the rest of the staff had begun to gather in small clusters, their conversations stopping mid-sentence as they caught sight of the unlikely pair. James could see the questions forming on their faces, could feel the judgment simmering beneath their carefully neutral expressions. He'd made his fortune by reading people, by understanding what they wanted before they even knew they wanted it, and right now he could read every person on this floor like an open book. They thought he'd gone soft. They thought he was having some kind of crisis. They thought this was temporary insanity that would pass once he came to his senses. James walked directly to the center of the open office area, still holding Rachel's hand, and cleared his throat. The conversations died immediately, replaced by an expectant silence that felt almost hostile in its intensity. Every eye was on him, waiting for an explanation, waiting for him to make sense of what appeared to be senseless. "I want to introduce someone to all of you," James said, his voice carrying across the space with the same authority he used in boardrooms and shareholder meetings. "This is Rachel. She's going to be working with us from now on. Specifically, she's going to be my assistant." The silence that followed was deafening. James watched as confusion rippled across faces, followed quickly by disbelief, and in some cases, barely concealed contempt. He saw Sarah from accounting lean toward Michael from legal and whisper something behind her hand, both of them glancing at Rachel, with expressions that suggested they'd just witnessed something vaguely obscene. He saw David from operations exchange a knowing look with Jennifer from PR, the kind of look that said they'd be discussing this at length over drinks later. He saw Thomas, one of his senior executives, actually shake his head slowly, as if disappointed by a decision he couldn't begin to comprehend. Rachel, for her part, seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of all those stares, pressing closer to James's side. She wasn't naive. Even at 6 years old, she could recognize judgment when she saw it. She could feel the way these people in their expensive clothes and their positions of power were looking at her, measuring her against some standard she would never meet, finding her lacking simply because of where she'd come from. James felt her hand tighten in his, felt the small tremor of fear or shame or both running through her, and something in him hardened into resolve. "Rachel will have a desk near mine," James continued, his tone brooking no argument. "She'll be attending certain meetings, helping with various projects and learning about how this company operates. I expect all of you to treat her with the same respect you would treat any other member of this team. Are there any questions?" The silence stretched on, no one willing to voice the questions that were clearly screaming in their minds. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "Sir, with all due respect, is this appropriate? She's a child. There are labor laws, liability concerns, not to mention, she's not on payroll," James cut him off smoothly. "She's here as part of an educational opportunity, properly documented and legally approved. I've already consulted with our legal team this morning." This was only partially true. He'd made the calls from the car on the way over, rushing through the paperwork that would cover him, but his tone suggested that the matter was settled and not open for debate. Thomas nodded slowly, his jaw tight, clearly unhappy but unwilling to push further. The rest of the staff began to slowly disperse, returning to their desks with backward glances and whispered conversations that James knew would dominate the office gossip for weeks to come. "Do not judge by appearances." James found himself thinking of those words as he watched his employees scatter, their faces arranged in careful neutrality that poorly masked their true feelings. They saw a little black girl from poverty and assumed she had nothing to offer them, nothing to teach them, nothing of value beyond being an object of either pity or suspicion. They saw his decision to bring her here as weakness or eccentricity or some kind of performative charity designed to make him look good. They couldn't see what he saw: strength, dignity, a moral courage that put every single person in this building to shame. James led Rachel to a desk that had been hastily set up near his office, complete with supplies, a comfortable chair adjusted to her height, and a small lamp that cast a warm glow. "This is yours," he said simply. Rachel stared at the desk as if it were made of gold, her eyes wide with wonder. "Really?" she whispered. "Really," James confirmed. "Now, your first task is to organize these files by date. Can you read dates?" Rachel nodded eagerly. "My mommy taught me. I can read lots of things." James smiled, a real smile that felt foreign on his face. "Good. Then let's get to work." As Rachel settled into her new desk, with an enthusiasm that made the expensive executives around her look jaded by comparison, James returned to his office and closed the door. Through the glass wall, he could see her bent over her task, her small hands carefully sorting papers, her face set in concentration. And beyond her, he could see the rest of his staff trying very hard to pretend they weren't watching, trying very hard to make sense of what their cold, untouchable boss had just done. The judgment was palpable, thick as smoke, but James found that he didn't care. For the first time in 7 years, he was doing something that mattered more than profit margins and quarterly reports. For the first time since Emma died, he was choosing to see the heart over the appearance, the person over the circumstance, the possibility over the prejudice. The whispers would continue. The judgment would spread. But none of it mattered as much as the sight of that little girl working diligently at her desk, earning her dignity one file at a time. Of all the people watching Rachel that morning, none watched with more intensity or more complicated emotion than Cynthia Reynolds. She stood in the doorway of her corner office, a crystal tumbler of water held delicately in one hand, her perfectly manicured nails drumming a slow rhythm against the glass. Cynthia was a senior executive at Walker Enterprises, a woman who had clawed her way up from middle management through a combination of sharp intelligence, tireless ambition, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what James Walker wanted before he knew he wanted it. At 42, she was striking rather than beautiful, with angular features that photographs loved and pale blue eyes that could freeze or seduce depending on what the situation required. She wore her success like armor, tailored Armani suits in neutral tones, Louboutin heels that added 3 inches to her height, jewelry that was expensive enough to signal status, but understated enough to suggest she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a flawless chignon, not a strand out of place, and her makeup was applied with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was just another form of currency in the world she inhabited. Cynthia had built her entire identity around being indispensable to James Walker, around being the one person in this entire building who truly understood him, who could read his moods and predict his needs and make herself invaluable in 1,000 subtle ways. For 3 years, she had been more than just his senior executive. She had been his confidant, his sounding board, the person he called late at night when a deal was going south, and he needed someone who could think as ruthlessly as he did. She had sat across from him at dinners that blurred the line between business and personal, had traveled with him to conferences in Dubai and London and Singapore, had learned to decode the silences that others mistook for coldness, but she recognized as grief. Cynthia had been patient, strategic, waiting for the day when James would finally see her not just as an asset, but as something more, someone who could fill the void that his daughter's death had left behind. And now, watching him stand beside a 6-year-old child from the streets, watching him smile at her in a way he had never smiled at Cynthia in all their years working together, she felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest. It wasn't just jealousy, though jealousy was certainly part of it. It was the realization that in less than 24 hours, this child had accomplished what Cynthia had been working toward for years. She had reached James Walker's heart. She had made him vulnerable again, had made him care, had made him human in a way that Cynthia had convinced herself only she could achieve if given enough time and opportunity. Cynthia took a slow sip of her water, her mind already calculating angles and possibilities. She told herself that her concerns were professional, that bringing a child into this environment was reckless and inappropriate, that James was clearly going through some kind of emotional crisis, and someone needed to protect him from himself. But underneath the rational justifications, underneath the polished exterior and the careful logic, was something more primal. The fear of being replaced, of being rendered irrelevant, of watching the man she had invested so much of herself in give his attention and affection to someone else. She watched Rachel bend over her desk with that innocent concentration, watched James glance over at her with something like fondness, and Cynthia made a decision. This situation needed to be managed, and she was exactly the person to manage it. The confrontation came 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon when the office was humming with the usual pre-weekend energy. Rachel had settled into a routine of sorts, arriving each morning with James after they visited her mother at the hospital, spending her days organizing files, sitting quietly in certain meetings, and asking questions that were surprisingly insightful for someone her age. The staff had begun to adjust to her presence, some with grudging acceptance, others with a warmth that surprised even themselves. But Cynthia had remained distant, watching from afar, biding her time, waiting for the right moment to intervene. That moment came when Rachel accidentally knocked over a stack of important contracts while reaching for a pencil. The papers scattered across the hallway floor, some sliding under desks, others drifting toward the elevator bay. Rachel immediately dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather them up, her face flushed with embarrassment and worry. Several people walked past without helping, stepping over the papers as if they were invisible. But Rachel kept scrambling, kept trying to fix her mistake before anyone noticed how badly she had messed up. Cynthia appeared seemingly from nowhere, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the sharp precision of a judge's gavel. She stood over Rachel, not bending down to help, not offering comfort, just standing there with her arms crossed and an expression of cold disappointment on her face. "Well," Cynthia said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby colleagues to hear, but not so far that it would be considered a public scene. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Children don't belong in professional environments, and this is why. Rachel looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, her small hands still clutching a handful of papers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. I'll fix it. I promise." Cynthia made a show of checking her watch, sighing as if she were dealing with an inconvenience that was testing her patience beyond reasonable limits. "These are legal documents, Rachel. Very important legal documents that took weeks to prepare. Do you even understand what you've done? Do you understand how much this carelessness could cost?" The little girl's eyes began to fill with tears, her lip trembling as she tried desperately not to cry in front of all these adults who were now watching the scene unfold. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice breaking. "I'm really, really sorry." Cynthia bent down now, but not to help, only to bring herself closer to Rachel's eye level, her voice dropping to a tone that was somehow both gentle and cutting. "Sweetheart, I'm sure you are sorry. But sorry doesn't fix mistakes. You're a nice little girl, but you're in over your head here. This isn't a playground. Maybe it would be better if you spent your time somewhere more appropriate for someone your age, somewhere you won't cause problems for people who are trying to do actual work." Rachel began gathering the papers even more frantically, tears now streaming down her cheeks, her whole body trembling with the effort of trying to hold herself together. A few people had stopped to watch now, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable pity to satisfied vindication, as if Cynthia was simply saying what they had all been thinking. The child didn't belong here. She was a disruption, a liability, a feel-good project that had gone too far. Rachel managed to collect most of the papers into a messy pile, but her hands were shaking so badly that some of them slipped through her fingers and scattered again. "I can do it," Rachel said desperately, her voice barely audible. "Please, I can fix it. I can do better." But Cynthia just shook her head, her expression one of practiced sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sure you can, sweetie, but maybe not here. Maybe not in a place like this where mistakes can have real consequences." That's when James's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Cynthia. Just her name, spoken in a tone that everyone in the office had learned to recognize as dangerous. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop by several degrees. James was standing in the doorway of his office, and the expression on his face was unlike anything most of these people had ever seen. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was something colder, more controlled, more absolute. He walked toward them slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Cynthia's face. "Mr. Walker," Cynthia said, standing up gracefully and arranging her features into professional concern. "I was just explaining to Rachel that perhaps she might be more comfortable in a different environment. She seems a bit overwhelmed by—" But James cut her off with a raised hand. "Stop talking," he said quietly. The command was so cold, so final, that Cynthia's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. James knelt down beside Rachel, who was still crying silently, and gently took the scattered papers from her shaking hands. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice completely different from the one he'd used with Cynthia. "Accidents happen. We'll fix this together." He began gathering the papers himself, organizing them into neat stacks, and after a moment's hesitation, Liz appeared from somewhere and knelt down to help. Then Marcus from security stepped forward. Then one of the junior analysts whose name James barely knew. Within seconds, half a dozen people were on their knees in that hallway, helping to collect the scattered documents, and Rachel's tears slowly began to subside as she realized she wasn't alone in her mistake. When the papers were all gathered and properly sorted, James stood up and turned to face Cynthia. The entire office had gone silent, everyone watching, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. "Cynthia," James said, his voice carrying across the space with perfect clarity. "You will never speak to Rachel that way again. You will never question her place here. You will never make her feel small or inadequate or unwelcome. Is that understood?" Cynthia's face had gone pale, her carefully constructed composure cracking just slightly around the edges. "I was only trying to—" "Is that understood?" James repeated, and this time there was steel in his voice that made even the most senior executives take an unconscious step back. Cynthia swallowed hard, her pride warring with her self-preservation instinct, and finally nodded. "Yes, Mr. Walker, it's understood." James held her gaze for a long moment, making sure the message was absolutely clear not just to Cynthia, but to everyone watching. "Rachel is under my protection," he said, speaking now to the entire office. "She is here because I want her here, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Anyone who makes her feel unwelcome will answer to me personally. Are we clear?" A murmur of assent rippled through the gathered staff, and James nodded once, satisfied. He turned back to Rachel, who was staring up at him with an expression of such profound gratitude and relief that it made something in his chest ache. "Come on," he said gently, offering her his hand. "Let's go get some water and take a break. You've had a rough afternoon." Rachel took his hand without hesitation, and together they walked back toward his office, leaving Cynthia standing alone in the hallway, her face carefully blank, but her eyes burning with something that looked dangerously like humiliation mixed with rage. "Whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble," the verse echoed in James's mind as he closed his office door behind them, and he made a mental note to keep a much closer eye on Cynthia Reynolds from now on. He had seen that look before, in boardrooms and negotiations, and he knew what it meant. Cynthia felt threatened, and threatened people were dangerous people. But as he watched Rachel slowly calm down, her breathing returning to normal as she sipped water from a paper cup, James made a silent vow. Whatever came next, whatever challenges emerged, he would not let anyone make this child feel small ever again. She had already endured more than most people faced in a lifetime, and she had done it with a dignity that shamed every adult in this building. The least he could do was make sure she felt safe while she was under his roof. Cynthia Reynolds had not climbed to the top of Walker Enterprises by accepting defeat gracefully. That night, sitting alone in her penthouse apartment with a glass of wine she didn't drink, she made a series of phone calls to people who specialized in finding things that others wanted to keep hidden. By morning, she had hired the best private investigation firm in the city, people who knew how to dig through records and uncover secrets without leaving fingerprints. Her instructions were simple. Find out everything about Rachel Marshall and her mother. Follow every thread. Leave no stone unturned. If there was something questionable about this situation, something that would prove James was being manipulated or taken advantage of, she would find it, and she would use it. The investigators worked quickly and efficiently, and within a week they delivered a folder that was thicker than Cynthia had anticipated. What they found was both surprising and, from Cynthia's perspective, perfectly damning. Diana Marshall had no birth certificate for Rachel. There were no hospital records of Rachel's birth, no prenatal care documentation, nothing that would prove a biological connection between the woman and the child. Instead, the investigators had uncovered something far more interesting. 7 years ago, Diana Marshall had been working as a night nurse at a private clinic when an infant was abandoned at the facility's back entrance. The baby had been wrapped in an expensive blanket with no note, no identification. Nothing except a small silver locket that Diana had kept all these years. Diana had taken the child home that night, had raised her as her own, had never reported the abandonment to authorities because she knew the system would swallow Rachel up, and she couldn't bear the thought of it. On paper, legally speaking, Diana had no claim to Rachel at all. The child was technically stolen property, or at the very least, she was being raised under false pretenses by a woman who had no legal right to call herself a mother. Cynthia read through the report 3 times, her mind racing with possibilities. This was exactly what she needed, exactly the kind of information that would force James to see reason, to understand that he was being played by people who weren't who they claimed to be. What is hidden will be revealed. Cynthia smiled to herself as she reached for her phone, already composing the message she would send to her media contacts. By tomorrow morning, everyone would know the truth about Rachel Marshall and her so-called mother. The story broke on a Friday morning, splashed across the front page of the city's most notorious tabloid, with a headline designed to inflict maximum damage. Billionaire manipulated by fake family, Walker's charity case built on lies. The article was brutal in its efficiency. laying out every detail the investigators had uncovered with the kind of breathless sensationalism that sold newspapers and destroyed reputations. There were photos, too, somehow obtained from security footage, showing James holding Rachel's hand, looking at her with unmistakable affection. The implication was clear and vicious. James Walker, the untouchable titan of industry, had been conned by a desperate woman and her stolen child. By noon, the story had spread to every major news outlet in the city. Cable news channels ran segments with titles like "Billionaire's Judgment Questioned" and "When Charity Goes Wrong." Social media exploded with opinions ranging from sympathy for James being deceived to cruel mockery of his supposed naivety. The most vicious comments were reserved for Diana and Rachel themselves, with people calling them grifters, liars, thieves who had manipulated a grieving man's emotions for financial gain. Photos of Rachel at the office circulated online, each one accompanied by increasingly hateful commentary about her presence there, about what kind of mother would use a child as a pawn in such a scheme. James learned about the story when his phone began ringing before dawn, call after call from board members and investors demanding explanations. By the time he arrived at the office, there were news vans parked outside the building and reporters shouting questions as he pushed through the crowd. Inside, the atmosphere was toxic with judgment and vindication. He could see it in the faces of his staff, the way they whispered and avoided eye contact, the way some of them looked almost satisfied that their doubts about Rachel had been proven correct. Cynthia was nowhere to be seen, but James knew instinctively that she was behind this, that she had orchestrated this exposure with the same precision she brought to hostile takeovers. Rachel hadn't come to the office that morning. James had called Diana the moment he saw the headlines, had told her to stay away, to keep Rachel safe from the media circus that was forming. But the damage was done. The tongue has the power of life and death, and right now those tongues were speaking death over a 6-year-old child who had never asked for any of this attention, who had only ever wanted to save her mother's life. That evening, James drove to the small apartment where Diana and Rachel lived, ignoring the photographers who followed him and the questions that were shouted at his car windows. He needed to hear the truth from Diana herself, needed to understand what had really happened 7 years ago and why she had never told him the full story. When Diana opened the door, her eyes were red from crying, her face drawn with exhaustion and shame. Rachel was asleep in the bedroom, mercifully unaware of the storm that was raging around them. They sat at Diana's tiny kitchen table, and she told him everything. She told him about the night she found the baby, about the expensive blanket and the silver locket, about how she had held that infant in her arms and felt something break open inside her that she didn't know could break. She had been unable to have children of her own, had spent years grieving that loss, and suddenly here was this perfect child who needed her, who would die without her. She told him about raising Rachel alone, about working double shifts to keep them fed and housed, about the constant fear that someone would discover the truth and take her daughter away. "I know I should have reported it," Diana said, her voice breaking. "I know I did something wrong, but I loved her from the first moment I held her, and I couldn't let her go into the system. I couldn't let her become just another statistic." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, placing it on the table between them. "This was with her when I found her. I've kept it all these years, thinking maybe someday I'd find out who her real family was. But the longer time went on, the more I convinced myself that I was her real family, that biology didn't matter as much as love." James picked up the locket with trembling hands, and when he opened it, the world seemed to tilt sideways. Inside was a tiny photograph, faded but still clear enough to recognize. It was him, years younger, standing beside a woman he had known briefly 8 years ago during a business trip to Chicago. Her name had been Sarah, and they had spent one weekend together before she disappeared without explanation, without contact information, without any way for him to find her again. He had thought about her occasionally over the years, wondered what had happened to her, but had eventually filed the memory away as just another of life's brief connections that didn't lead anywhere. But apparently it had led somewhere. Apparently that weekend had created a life, and Sarah had left that life on the steps of a clinic rather than tell him about it. James stared at the photograph, his mind reeling with implications, with possibilities. with the sudden understanding that everything about this situation was far more complicated than anyone had realized. The DNA test took 3 days to process, 3 days during which James barely slept, and the media continued to tear apart his reputation with gleeful efficiency. When the results finally came back, delivered in a plain manila envelope that felt heavy as lead in his hands, James sat alone in his office and stared at the numbers that would change everything. 99.98% probability of paternity. Rachel wasn't just some child he had taken pity on. She wasn't just Diana's illegally adopted daughter. She was his own flesh and blood, his own child, the daughter he never knew he had created during one weekend 8 years ago with a woman who had chosen to abandon their baby rather than face him with the truth. Before I formed you, I knew you. The words came to him like a whisper from somewhere beyond himself, and James felt tears streaming down his face for the first time since Emma's funeral. All this time, all these years, Rachel had been out there struggling and suffering and fighting to survive, and he had never known. He thought about her walking 7 blocks on bare feet to beg for a job, thought about her sitting on that marble floor with such quiet dignity, thought about the crayon drawing she had made showing a little girl and a tall man standing together. She had drawn what she hoped for, what she dreamed about, and somehow, impossibly, it had been true all along. James went to the hospital where Diana had been receiving continued treatment, and he asked to speak with Rachel privately. Diana brought her to a quiet waiting room, and Rachel entered cautiously, her eyes uncertain after days of being kept away from the office and the chaos. James knelt down so he was at her level, just as he had done that first day, and he took both of her small hands in his. "Rachel," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something very important. Something that's going to change everything for both of us." He explained it as simply as he could, told her about the DNA test and what it meant, told her that he wasn't just someone who wanted to help her, but someone who was connected to her in the deepest possible way. Rachel listened with those wide, serious eyes, processing information that would have overwhelmed most adults, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked in a small voice, "Does that mean you're my daddy?" James nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what it means." Rachel threw her arms around his neck with such force that they both nearly fell over, and she held on to him as if she would never let go. James wrapped his arms around her, this daughter he had never known existed, this miracle who had walked into his life disguised as Charity and revealed herself as Grace. Behind them, Diana stood watching with tears streaming down her face, and James reached out his hand to her, pulling her into their embrace. "Thank you," he said fiercely. "Thank you for loving her. Thank you for keeping her safe. Thank you for being the mother she needed when I didn't even know she existed." He sets the lonely in families, and in that quiet hospital waiting room, 3 people who had been lost and broken and alone found themselves suddenly, impossibly, made whole. The company-wide meeting was called for Monday morning, mandatory attendance for every employee of Walker Enterprises. The conference room was packed, people standing along the walls when the seats filled up, everyone whispering speculation about what this emergency gathering could mean. Some thought James was stepping down after the scandal. Others thought he was going to make some kind of public apology. A few, the ones who had seen the look in his eyes lately, suspected something else entirely but couldn't quite name what. James walked in with Rachel beside him, and the whispers died immediately. He helped her up onto a chair so everyone could see her, and then he stood beside her with one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "I'm going to keep this brief," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Many of you have seen the news stories about Rachel and her mother. Many of you have heard the accusations and the speculation. I'm here to tell you the truth, because you deserve to hear it from me rather than from tabloids and gossip." He paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "Rachel is my daughter, my biological daughter. The DNA test came back 3 days ago with a 99.98% match. She isn't a charity case. She isn't someone trying to manipulate me. She's my child, and I didn't know she existed until she walked into our lobby 2 weeks ago." The room exploded into shocked murmurs, people turning to each other with expressions of disbelief and wonder. James held up his hand for silence and continued. Her mother, Diana, is the woman who found Rachel as an abandoned infant and raised her with more love and sacrifice than most biological parents ever manage. She kept my daughter safe, fed and cared for under impossibly difficult circumstances, and instead of being attacked in the media, she should be honored for her courage and her compassion. His voice grew stronger, more forceful. I will not tolerate any more judgment of Rachel or Diana. They are my family now, and anyone who cannot treat them with respect has no place in this company. Is that clear? The room erupted in applause, spontaneous and overwhelming, and James saw tears on many faces as people stood to show their support. Even Thomas, who had been so skeptical in the beginning, was clapping with genuine emotion. Rachel looked around in wonder, and then she smiled, a real smile that lit up the entire room. In the back corner, Cynthia Reynolds stood frozen, her face pale as paper, watching her carefully constructed world crumble around her. She had orchestrated the investigation, leaked the story to the media, convinced herself that she was protecting James from manipulators and con artists. Instead, she had publicly attacked a man's daughter, had tried to destroy the relationship between a father and child who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control. The weight of what she had done crashed over her like a wave, and she felt physically sick with shame and regret. After the meeting ended, and people filed out still buzzing with the revelation, Cynthia approached James's office with trembling hands. She found him there with Rachel, helping her practice writing her name in cursive. When Cynthia knocked on the open door, both of them looked up, and Cynthia saw Rachel instinctively move closer to James, fear flickering across her young face. That small movement, that wordless expression of how much she had hurt this child, broke something inside Cynthia that she didn't know could break. "Mr. Walker," Cynthia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel, I need to apologize." She stepped into the office, and then, before either of them could respond, she did something she had never done in her entire professional life. She lowered herself to her knees, not in some performative gesture but in genuine humility, her expensive suit creasing on the floor, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. "I was wrong," she said, and the words cost her everything. "I was jealous and bitter, and I used my resources to hurt you both. I convinced myself I was protecting James, but I was really just protecting my own position, my own ego. What I did was cruel and inexcusable, and I will understand if you never forgive me." Rachel looked at James, uncertainty in her eyes, and he gave her a small nod, leaving the decision to her. Rachel slid down from her chair and walked over to where Cynthia knelt, and for a long moment she just looked at the woman who had tried to destroy her family. Then, with the kind of grace that only children seem to possess naturally, Rachel reached out and placed her small hand on Cynthia's shoulder. "It's okay," she said quietly. "My mommy says that hurt people, and that we should forgive them because they're probably sad inside. Are you sad inside?" Cynthia's composure finally broke completely, and she began to cry, deep wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and wounded within her. "Yes," she managed to say, "I'm very sad inside." Rachel patted her shoulder gently. "Then I forgive you, and maybe you can try to be happier now." It was such a simple statement, delivered with such pure compassion, that even James felt his eyes burning. "Forgive, and you will be forgiven." Cynthia looked up at this child she had tried to harm, this 6-year-old who was showing her more mercy than she had ever shown anyone, and she nodded slowly. "Thank you, Rachel. I don't deserve it, but thank you." Within 2 months, everything had changed. James purchased a house in Westchester, not ostentatious but comfortable, with a backyard where Rachel could play and enough bedrooms for all of them. He had offered Diana her own place, given her enough money that she would never have to work again if she didn't want to, but she had refused anything that felt like charity. Instead, she accepted a position managing the foundation that James established in Rachel's name, a foundation dedicated to helping single parents and abandoned children find the resources and support they needed. It was work that gave her purpose and dignity, work that honored both her past struggles and her future possibilities. Rachel was enrolled in one of the best private schools in the area, where teachers who actually cared about students as individuals helped her catch up on the education she had missed during her years of poverty. She made friends quickly, her natural kindness and resilience drawing other children to her like moths to light. She still came to the office sometimes on weekends, still helped James with simple tasks, but now it was about spending time together rather than trying to earn her worth through labor. She had learned slowly that she was valuable simply because she existed, not because of what she could do or provide. Diana and James spent more and more time together as they co-parented Rachel, and somewhere in the countless conversations about school schedules and doctor's appointments and bedtime routines, something shifted between them. They began having dinner together after Rachel was asleep, talking about things that had nothing to do with their daughter, discovering that they actually enjoyed each other's company. Diana's quiet strength balanced James's intensity, and his stability provided her with a safety she had never known. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something deeper and more sustainable, a love built on respect and shared purpose, and the gradual realization that they were better together than apart. Love never fails, and in this case, love was learning to take its time, to build foundations before constructing walls, to honor what they had already created together before trying to create something new.